Now, Syria has blasted Western accusations on its use of a chemical weapon, saying such allegations are, quote, a campaign of lies. Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal Miqdad made the comment during an annual conference of signatories to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Miqdad said the accusations are leveled without any tangible evidence. A UN inquiry, the Joint Investigative Mechanism, has accused the Syrian army of 3 chemical attacks on villages in 2014 and 2015, but Miqdad said the report is based on inaccurate findings. Russia has also dismissed the findings as unconvincing and sometimes even partial. Western governments, led by the U.S., have long accused the Syrian army of using chemical weapons. Damascus has repeatedly denied such charges, blaming Daesh and other Western-backed militants for the use of the banned arms. Joining us now via Skype from Paris is Joe Quinn. He's the editor and researcher at SOT.net. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Mr. Quinn. Now, what do you make of these accusations being leveled against Syria as far as the use of chemical weapons go? Because let's not forget, we went through the motions of Syria getting rid of its chemical weapons under the auspices of the organization that overlooks these chemical weapons, so to speak.
Right, that's very accurate, and something that's not been mentioned by the Western media and Western governments when they make these accusations against Syria. That in 2013 they were part, along with Russia, part of a program to ensure that to remove or destroy all of Syria's chemical weapon stockpiles. So even by the U.S. government's own admission, Syria has no chemical weapons. So how can the Syrian government and the Syrian military be using chemical weapons? The other problem is that back in 2013, a UN mission report actually confirmed that it was opposition groups, rebel groups, so-called rebel groups in Syria, that had used chemical weapons against civilians in the Syrian military. So that's just one example. There have been many incidences where, over the past 3 or 4 years, where chemical weapons have been used, and they're under investigation right now. But most of the evidence for the use of these chemical weapons points to Syrian rebels, and these are the Syrian rebels that are being funded and trained and armed by the Western governments and their allies in the Middle East. So this is just pure propaganda. It's, as the Syrian minister said, it's a campaign of lies against Syria to try and continue to demonize the Syrian government, which is democratically elected. As many people apparently don't know, it's a democratically elected government in free and fair elections in 2014. So yeah, it's just more lies. And of course, this is coming from countries, for example, the USA and European countries, who themselves have a history of fabricating evidence like this to demonize a country so they can justify an invasion or a bombing campaign of that country. And I mean, the one big example that most people know is the justification for the invasion of the Iraq War in 2013 was based on the claim by the West that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons. And that was proven to be a lie, and everyone knows that was a lie. So you're talking about people who are proven liars, who are discredited by history, by their own history, and by what they've done over the past 10 or 15 years. So why anyone would believe what they say is beyond me.
Right. Now, what we have seen also in the past is that the U.S. as well as other Western governments have spoken of Daesh Takfiri terrorists using chemical weapons in Iraq. Why is it so hard for them to believe that the terrorist group that operates on Syrian soil are capable of the same thing?
Well, it's not that it's so hard for them to believe. It's hard for them to admit that, because of course these kind of so-called rebel groups, including quote-unquote Daesh or ISIS, are effectively a proxy mercenary army used by Western powers in an attempt to overthrow, in this case, the Syrian government. So, of course, they're not going to admit that these groups have used chemical weapons in other places, and that obviously if there's any allegations that chemical weapons have been used, it's most likely going to be them. And of course, just recently, Turkey, the Turkish government, I think just yesterday, accused ISIS or Daesh of using chemical weapons against Turkish-backed Syrian rebels. So, I mean, all of the evidence here points at these rebel groups of one stripe or another as being the ones who are using chemical weapons. And of course, they're getting chemical weapons from Western government allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, for example, or Qatar. So it's laughable propaganda when we hear the Syrian government being accused of this, when in fact it's very obvious that it's these rebels who are behind these chemical attacks.
Right, so what does this propaganda, though, hope to achieve? How far will these allegations against the Syrian government go?
Well, back in 2013, this very same allegation of the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government was made by the US and its European allies in particular in an effort to justify, at that time, a NATO bombing of the country, which they came very close to actually bombing Syria in the same way that NATO bombed Libya in 2011, but that was thwarted or forestalled by the Russian government at the time. So it is quite dangerous that they are ramping up these allegations again of the tired old chemical weapons a la Saddam Hussein against the Syrian government, because it seems that the US government is at this point thinking again about the possibility of establishing a no-fly zone, as they would call it, in Syria, which basically would mean a NATO bombardment of the country. This seems to be the way that the pretext for NATO bombings of countries is to falsely accuse a country of Syrian or of chemical weapon attacks. So everybody should understand that at this point. We all have a lot of experience. The public have a lot of experience of these kind of lies and this phony pretext for doing this, and no one should believe it. So it's dangerous, and we'll just have to wait and see where they're going to go with it. But personally, I think it's unlikely because of the Russian influence and presence on the ground in Syria, but we'll just have to wait and see.
All right, wait and see it is. That's Joe Quinn, editor and researcher at SOT.net, joining us via Skype from Paris. Many thanks indeed, Mr. Quinn, for your comments here on Press TV.